Hi everyone. First of all, my sincere apologies for not posting any videos in the last couple of weeks. I've been a little bit busy with my classes and some other issues, but hopefully following today's video, I will post another follow-up video either by the end of this week or the beginning of next week. In today's video, I'd like to start focusing a little bit more on my own context. As a lot of you may know by now, I've been teaching in Chinese universities for about the past 8 years. I've taught lots of different courses, both to bachelor's degree students, master's degree, and even PhD students as well. And that includes English majors, non-English majors, and so on and so forth. I'll probably use my other videos to get into the details of my courses a little bit more. I've had some people asking me about my debate course, which I'd like to tackle in my next video. But for today, what I'd actually like to focus on are some stereotypes about Chinese students. And if you've taught in China before, or you're teaching in somewhat of a similar context, and I'm sure these are stereotypes that you've come across. So the stereotypes I guess we hear a lot about Chinese students are one, that Chinese students are not creative or not creative enough. Two, that they are quiet, they don't want to speak. Three, that they don't have opinions and they don't want to share them. And finally, that Chinese students cannot work effectively in groups. So I don't want to use this video just to completely disagree with all four of these stereotypes, or to say that they are simply lazy stereotypes or anything like that. I think there are interesting points to deal with, and definitely interesting points to discuss. I just like to use this video today to give my perspective and my thoughts on these four issues. And so the first one, that Chinese students are not creative. I think always what you're dealing with in China is that, you know, especially if you're teaching at university level, the students have come through this rigorous succession of exams right through to their college entrance exam, what we call their Gaokao, when they're around about 18 years old. And these exams really reward, rote memorization. Students will be drilled in grammar, vocabulary, reading comprehensions, and so on and so forth. And so it's very difficult for them to suddenly flick a switch as soon as they get into university life and be expected to, come up with creative ideas and, like we said before, kind of express their opinions that little bit more. And now China generally wants to reward this creativity. It wants new ideas, but the transition between being a high school student, getting a good score on your entrance exam, and suddenly being a creative, thought-provoking university level student is very, very difficult for them. And for that reason, I think you cannot just sit there and say, well, these students don't have creative ideas. I think you'll find they do. The ideas are there. But as a teacher, your main job is to find the right platform and, in fact, the right tasks to, if you like, extract this creativity. So no matter what you're teaching, I find that, especially at first, if you're with first-year students or students who have not had that exposure to a more creative and communicative classroom environment, that you have to structure your tasks so much more. Now, I'm a big advocate of student-centered learning, but at the same time, you have to build that. In all of my courses, whether they are content-based courses, oral English courses, or writing courses even, I see a big difference between the way I teach in the first few weeks of that course and how I'm teaching by the end of it. So, for example, in the first few weeks, it probably is slightly more teacher-centered in terms of giving my instructions. The tasks are broken down into more kind of 5-minute, 10-minute tasks. We come back together, we evaluate, we do the next step, and we do this again and again. By the end of that course, I can give out a 45-minute task and take a step back and let the students kind of get on with it. So I think in terms of their creativity, it's something that is there. There are ideas there. But the thought process is something that needs to be stimulated and actually really needs to be coached by the teacher. So I get that frustration with creativity. I personally think it's more about how you structure your tasks, particularly at the beginning of a course. So being quiet, for anyone who's done any research into Chinese educational culture and Chinese culture in general, we are dealing with this Confucian culture, right? So absolute respect for the teacher, what the teacher says is right, and this can cause, a slight reticence, I guess, of students either wanting to speak out in class, challenge the teacher, and in fact, for a lot of students, speaking out and being wrong. Again, in terms of quietness, the very, very simple way to deal with this, in fact, some Chinese students told me this the first few weeks into my course: if you're waiting for students to volunteer, you know what, just call on them. They have something to say. Learn student names as quickly as you can, use name cards, whatever, and just call on people and they will tell you something. For me personally, and this maybe we'll come back to when we discuss groups a little bit later, some teachers will go in there and they will ask a question and kind of hit the students, by surprise, or just catch the students cold, and then wonder why they're not getting responses or why students are not really willing to speak out. For me, and no matter what level the class is, I do like to give students time in their groups to discuss things first and then report back. Either have one person from each group reporting back, or them kind of doing it in a more structured or team-based way. But I always find a massive difference if I've given students, either just 5 minutes in their group or with their partner to discuss their ideas first. They're always so much more willing afterwards to give me their thoughts. And I think part of that is to get for them some validation from their peers that what they are saying is right, that the people around them understand their opinion, or that the people around them either agree with them, and that maybe gives them that little bit more confidence to speak out and tell you about it. And of course, there are the ways to deal with that, kind of going and sitting with individual groups of students rather than doing everything in front of the whole class. But this idea that students are quiet, again, some people are quiet, some people are louder. As a teacher, you sometimes just got to balance that. You don't want one student dominating, of course. And if you do come across quiet students, you know what? Speaking out in front of a whole class full of students is not easy for anyone. So either just kind of calling on them and not giving them a lot to do at once, I guess, or just kind of going and sitting with different groups and getting your answers that way. But yeah, quietness can be an issue. Again, a lot of that depends on the task. Chinese students don't have opinions. I would say that, again, as we kind of mentioned about being quiet, I think it's more of a fear of being wrong. And this, idea that the teacher is maybe right, that they shouldn't disagree with the teacher. They don't necessarily want to disagree with the people around them. In Chinese culture, we talk a lot about social harmony. What I actually like to do in a lot of my questions is not always just ask, what do you think about something, but actually structure the tasks in more of a way of like an analytical way of looking at the advantages and disadvantages of an issue before we get to people's opinion. So we come up with both sides first. Now that can be in my debate class, that can be in a standard oral English class, and certainly be in a writing class, but structuring the task in a way that looks at both sides. You have arguments on both sides, you have points on both sides, and then trying to see what the students agree or disagree with. I always find that method a lot more successful than just hitting students with, what do you think about this? And on the odd occasion that I have done that and speaking to other teachers doing that, students are a lot less willing to give up their opinion. And finally, this idea that students in China don't work well in groups. Now, during my research for my master's dissertation, I did find a lot of interesting things out about group work in China. I think the line from one of my interviews, which stuck with me, was from a girl who said that quite often in groups, she is just waiting for the other people to be quiet so she can have a turn to speak, which I, maybe that's, for a lot of people, that's just conversation in general, right? But yeah, kind of making the group worthwhile for the students, not just as a way to fill class time, or as a way for you as a teacher to feel that the students are all talking at once and they are doing something. I think actually making the groups worthwhile for students is a very interesting one. What I do like to do, as I've said before, is give students work to do in their groups, but always reporting back. And that depends on the class, but that reporting back I find quite useful. The way you structure your groups, I think, is always a tricky one. You're always going to have stronger and weaker students in a class. For the stronger students, there's a temptation to use them as a tool, as a teaching tool. But at the same time, for them, they need to be pushed and cannot be expected to work with weaker students the whole time. Of course, in China, there's a big expectation amongst students that they get to go to class and sit with their friends as well. So I think kind of balancing how you mix students up, how you pair students, not letting students work with the same people every time, but then also not kind of mixing them up constantly, I think is a balance to get. And maybe you can even design a little kind of rotation system amongst your class. This week they're with people they know, next week stronger students are with weaker students, the next week stronger students are kind of put together. Maybe that is a way to do that. I think for groups in China, what I've really found is that I have to be quite explicit in my instructions of what I expect from the group. Just giving us a group of 4 students a question and saying you've got 50 minutes to talk about this, I find it's not a great use of time. I find the conversations do often just kind of peter out. If it's a more goal-oriented task, I think this works a lot better if they have to produce something at the end of that period of group work. It always kind of keeps them focused. I'd also say amongst groups that depending on the task, whether you go and sit with them or take a step back is always a tough decision to make. I do like to monitor my groups as I move around. If I feel that they are going off topic or I feel that they are not accomplishing anything, I will go and sit with them. If the group is working well, I stay away. That sounds quite obvious, but I think in terms of groups, you also have to think about your own expectations. And this kind of goes back to that initial point about building up during your course. Now, at the beginning of course, you can give students group work to do, 5 or 10 minutes. That's probably as much as they can handle. By the end of a course, if you've been coaching them and showing them how to work in groups, they've got more used to the type of tasks that you expect them to accomplish, then yeah, sure, give them a 45-minute task and tell them to get going with that, so long as they have to produce something in the end. And I think that's always a key point. So generally, dealing with Chinese students, I actually find to be an absolute pleasure. It's such an interesting context to work in, but there are certainly challenges, not just the 4 kind of stereotypes that I've spoken about in today's video, but things come up every single day in my classes that I have to deal with, or at least kind of get me thinking. So what I'd really like to do in my next video is to discuss how the things that I do in the class and my courses help to deal with some of the issues that I've spoken about today. So my next video, I'd actually like to talk about debating in English. So I teach students how to debate and coach them in debating. And as you'll maybe see in my next video, a lot of the things we've spoken about today, I feel are dealt with extremely well by debate classes in a TEFL context. Okay, so thank you very much for listening. Slightly longer video today, a little bit of a ramble, I guess, but hopefully I've given you some food for thought on these stereotypes about Chinese students. Okay, thank you very much for the views. I really appreciate your comments and your feedback. And of course, if you could like and share the video, I would be very, very grateful. Okay. Enjoy the rest of your week, and I will speak to you soon.